please welcome Damian Woetzel and Cameron Carpenter.
Hi, I'm Damian Woetzel, and this is Cameron Carpenter. So, by way of explanation quickly, I am a former dancer, but I retired in 2008. I've done, half of my life has been what was expected of me, which is directing and producing things that are performance. But the other half is doing work in arts policy, and it led me to the Aspen Institute, which is engaged in the pursuit of a better society, for a very basic explanation, in economics and diplomacy and politics and you name it, and the arts. So I run arts programs for that, and we have a program called the Artist in Residence Program, and I'm proud to say that Cameron is an artist in residence of the Aspen Institute. And what that entails, essentially, is giving him the vehicle whenever possible to expand on his own personal vision for how the arts can be more intricately related to good work in society, to his own development of what he believes the arts should be in the world. And I think I want to start right there because Cameron is anything but small scale, as we're going to find out over the course of this evening. So when I say world, I really mean the world. And so when we started talking, you really laid out for me a vision that was challenging and on a very high level for your own involvement in the arts. And
That's right. Well, the organ, as some of you maybe are aware, is an instrument that has had an integral role in the arts, partly due to its long history, partly due to its origins in ancient Greece, and partly due to its sort of onus as a functionary of other events and other things.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. You're talking about religion, for instance.
Well, now that you mention it,
okay, we'll get there.
But the thing is that the role of the organ today is enormously in flux. I think the most polar opposites of the most Luddite, inveterate organ academic would have to admit that, if nothing else. And so there is a necessity as an organist. I view it almost as an ethical imperative to investigate ways in which the organ can. I don't see it as an issue of regaining its lost glory. I think the days of the pipe organ are behind us. The greatest days of those days are not to return. The question now is the degree to which the organ, as a continuing humanity, one which throughout its history has always been defined by evolution, will have a place in today's society. And it's my position that technology is indivisible from the solution to that. And again, that's not actually a radical thought, that the organ has always been at the forefront of technology, and actually until 1877, when the telephone exchange was invented, was not only the most complicated musical instrument, but the most complicated man-made device.
Fantastic.
So there's actually a long precedent.
This is already a phenomenal amount of information. We could just stop there and dissect that for the next couple of hours.
I'm going to rely on you to hold me back.
I'm going to say, though, that that's a logical segue to how one communicates about the types of high-level thinking you're discussing is not the easiest thing. And I was thinking earlier today about great scientists who have been pioneers not only in science, but in communicating about science. So I'm thinking about, obviously, Dr. Hawking, Stephen Hawking, or Brian Greene with the Elegant Universe, and ways in which very complex thoughts can be made simple and understandable by a variety of people who are not necessarily, experts in the field. And when we started talking about your, Artist in Residence Aspen Institute opportunity, you came to us and said, well, what I'd really like to do is be able to place the organ in its context for society, but I'd like to make sure I do it with children. And so I'm happy to say that launched this afternoon right here with, I think it was about 25 kids. And your mission in that, well, you should explain it, but the way I understood it, tell me if I'm wrong, was that you wanted to make it relevant to them, but not just simply telling them about it or, explaining, things about it, but actually giving them a chance to be at the keys, at the pedals, and experience it.
Right. Well, I'll put it this way. There is a lot of effort expended by the organ community at large in recruiting young organists. That is an effort which I think is commendable in general. It's not something that I would ever choose to stand in the way of, but my focus is elsewhere. It's my position that the path that led me to the organ is maybe more representative of something that could be generally relatable to an overall goal of health, not just for the kids whom it affects, but in a long view for the organ itself. There's no doubt in my mind that the organ, whatever crisis it faces, will always have adherents. It will always have dedicated young people, many of whom are now playing at a higher level than has ever been attained in history. In the days of Marcel Dupré and Jean Damasio, it would be very, very rare for a high technical level comparable to pianists to be reached. Today it's quite commonplace. So while I believe in a future for the organist, it's not specifically that I'm trying to do. It's my belief that the organ as a humanity, as a mathematical, as a rational tool and a machine, not of faith, but of science, and particularly in a way of a kind of complete musical universe in itself, has the capacity to change young minds simply by dint of exposure. I believe that's what it did to me, and that's simply what I'd like to share with other kids, particularly young and, in some cases, underprivileged kids.
So a small goal, changing the minds and the opportunities that they can imagine. I mean, in my mind, it's like expanding imagination, expanding all kinds of access. And today's kids were a mixture. Some actually had quite good musical chops. Some had no experience whatsoever, simply. And you managed to connect with all of them over the course of an hour. And I guess the first thing I should ask you about it, do you think it worked?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
And because I think that the essence here, of course, is not to try to agendize those kids to play Bach. For one thing, I think it's absolutely shown by, for instance, such initiatives as the remarkably successful and well-traveled pipe organ encounter by the American Guild of Organists, that young kids who are determined to become organists will do so. There's not necessarily a reason to recruit them. There's no stopping them. And that's a fabulous thing sort of over to the side. What I'm interested in is simply making people aware of not only the organ in general, but this instrument, which it's my unabashed position is the greatest organ in the world. So now, I have to qualify that a little bit to explain myself. It's not that I believe that the great organs of fill in the blank are somehow bested by this. That would be a misunderstanding of what the organ is. The essence of a great organ is that it is intensely personal, and that it is intensely spectral in the sense of having many, many different spectrums of expression, of possibility, and in a sense, embodying, again, a complete universe in itself. There is never a need to really dictate that this or that organ is the greatest, because it can be possible to make the greatest, to each organ that you play in some sense, the greatest. What I mean by that, though, is that it's this organ to me that most aptly represents the instrument as something other than a tool of religious propaganda shrouded in Christianisms. It's this instrument that represents the organ as an outreaching, expressive, changeable, tangible medium, and the fact that it is not a pipe organ, but that it sidesteps the entire mechanism of the literality of the pipe organ at a stroke, sort of pushing that whole can't see the forest for the trees question right out of the picture and forcing one to acknowledge that actually the only relevant thing about an organ, much less than the means by which it generates sound, is the emotional impact it generates and what it reflects about the player and its music. That is something that it doesn't require a doctorate to understand, and
so
what is
very
valuable to the young mind, I think.
I mean, I would agree with you that it worked today because all of that was clear and it actually connected without explaining any of that. And that was really the point, that it was simply made available, that incredible spectrum, which is really the word, of possibilities and and frankly the feeling, the emotional feeling, but also the physical feeling in the room was, something that you can't replace. It's that unique opportunity.
Quite so. Well, there's just a slight other issue about this organ, which is though while it is incredibly obstreperous to move around, it actually does move around, and it's the stagehands and my poor road crew who has to worry about that. So it is a touring organ. It has already played on 4 continents. It's played in China. I've played it in Australia. I've played it all over Western Europe, and this is its second tour of America and its first tour of Canada. And that itself, you have to understand, is a profound queering of the question of what an organ is. Because even a very small, by small I mean in terms of musical resources, organ is essentially utterly immobile, at least immobile without the risk of damaging to the instrument, without extensive peripheral work.
This is a site-specific thing.
A site-specific instrument.
Yeah.
But even site specificity, as you'll have known it from choreography, is somewhat malleable and tourable.
Absolutely, and
the
that's
pipe organ
usually
is
a
not,
happy
of course.
thing because you find new aspects.
And
but
it's
you don't
by
get
design.
to do that.
It's
Yeah.
by design. The ethos of this instrument is to present a great, comprehensive, complete instrument wherever it plays, and conversely to allow me to play my private home instrument for everybody that I play for, just as a violinist would. That's why it is my primary organ. It's why I don't record on pipe organs. It's why I regard pipe organs as a substitute to be used for it when it is not available. Right. And because of that, you have the confrontation. You have to be confronted with the idea that this organ for the next 3 months is on tour, 40 concerts in America. Can it really be that we don't make a serious effort every time it's staged to open it up to children, and I mean any children who want to play it? Can it really be that we're not using social media to do that? That's right. What this afternoon was really about, and that's what we'll be attempting to do everywhere the organ goes.
So it is a mission, very clearly. It is going to be baked into the proposition, as you said. And I would say that, it takes a number of different players to make that happen. And to my mind, with a lot of the work I do, the coordinative ability is where things either happen or they don't. It's just like the greatest ideas in the world, but if somebody's not in the middle of it kind of saying, okay, here's how it's going to happen, nothing. And so I think we have to say with incredible gratitude that SFJAZZ made that happen. And they've turned into the model for how a presenter should deal with you on this venture.
Hear, hear.
So I'm looking for basically the one-pager from SFJAZZ. This is how we got it done. And then it just goes to every stop on your tour. And then you do get that access to those kids from all backgrounds and all levels of musical knowledge.
That's right, and including none.
Including none, I mean, there was one young man who really had quite a bit. He was telling you what he wanted.
Yes.
And then there were some who just literally wanted to feel what it felt like to touch a pedal
right.
and have their pants start to shake,
Yes.
And it was just like, wow, this is possible.
Well, the thing is that there's actually a precedent for this. I mean, this organ was launched at Lincoln Center in 2014, and since then it's been, I mean, it's I think its own proof of concept in the sense that it demonstrates, by inversion, you might say, how many obstacles the pipe organ puts in the way of an organist who would be competitive in the sort of the way that musical commerce is globalized. But this organ has already been so much on the road that there have been many, many times when parents and kids will simply write into me on Facebook and say, could we come and see it? And I grew really weary of having 6 and 7 kids between, say, the ages of 4, which is when, after all, I began playing, and, say, 13 or 14, after the concert, who I could only take to see the console as the thing was being wheeled away and disconnected, with its tentacles coming out and being made into sushi. I mean, by then it's too late. So, and in terms of the infrastructure and the organizational bit, I've always been extremely pro-union. And it's my experience that the unions in this country in houses have on case-by-case basis been very supportive of just that effort. There will, of course, be places where we can't do it. That's part of why we make it an initiative. I want to go on record as saying I'm not putting any pressure on any of my presenters or anything like that. But I just want to be absolutely clear that the cliched, long-standing tradition of organists locking up organs will have nothing to do with this instrument or me.
Great. So let's leave what we're going to call, Cameron's education initiative aside for a moment and turn to mentorship, because this is the second aspect that you spoke to me about, and we're happy that this again is a bit of a launching point for. And the first question I'd have is, did you have a mentor for the organ as a young person?
I've been very lucky to have several. My first really proper mentor was a guy named David First, who was a local piano tuner in Meadville, Pennsylvania, who was the first person to really see that something computationally was trying to happen in my little twisted brain. And my parents, to their great good credit, sent me to the American Boy Choir School in Princeton, New Jersey. I had a wide range of organ lessons with incredible people. When I was 11 years old, I had an organ lesson with Kurt Mazur, with Julian Weir, a number of other people. The then director of the boy choir, Dr. James Litton, was one of my first great mentors, and then I've had several others over the years. And I, of course, would like to be in a position, not to try to influence anybody, but just to try to support young talent as much as possible. And there happens to be one outstanding talent whom I consider to be a person of genius that I've been fortunate enough to be able to share a little limelight with now, and that's exciting.
So you're going to meet this young person in a moment. And so you called us up about 2 weeks ago and said, I think it would be really appropriate, if it's possible, that we bring this young man to this concert and launch that idea of, I don't want to say institutionalizing, but, institutionalizing mentorship a little bit, like saying this is how we work, this is things we can do, and therefore we will do.
Well, the organ is an institutional instrument, and certainly one might expect to be institutionalized if you devote your life to it. It's occurred to me several times.
Yes.
That's how it goes. The thing is, I don't want to seem to sideswipe anybody's interest in cultivating young organists. I'm all for that, and young organists, by the way, will always be just as welcome and always are to play this instrument. But it's my feeling that there's more than one kind of young organist. I think a lot of really hard inquiry is also needed on the part of the organ community to determine exactly how we're equipping young classical organists to lead a satisfying professional and economic life. Organists are among the worst paid and hardest working musicians. Even the very top pay scale of the American Guild of Organists, it caps out with benefits at something around $136,000, which is barely an entry-level orchestral musician. So before we go too gung-ho about being certain that the classical organ is really a field that deserves the entire future of a young person, I think we owe it to ourselves also to look at the rest of what an organist can be. And that's why particularly as somebody who started playing the Hammond organ, I have to be interested in what the future of the secular organist is. And particularly when you have a voice of originality that's tied to the entire history of the organ, not just as a jazz instrument, but particularly the Hammond organ as a rival at times to the pipe organ and as an instrument which through technology has evolved in its own right. It would be ridiculous not to support somebody who you met who needed the support in that role.
All right. Well, I think that's about as much of a lead up as we should give. And why don't we introduce Matthew
So
Whitaker.
I'd like to introduce you all to my great friend Matthew Whitaker.
So we're going to take Matthew over to the Hammond.
What are you going to play?
I'm going to be playing a song by Tony Monaco. It's called I'll Remember Jimmy.
That wouldn't have to do with Jimmy Smith by any chance, would it?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. Fantastic. Matthew Whitaker. Yeah. So before we let Matthew go, stay with us for 1 sec, Matthew. So we'll tell you more about Matthew as the night goes on, and you'll meet him again later on in the concert. But he's 14. Matthew has been blind since birth. He lives and was born in Hackensack, New Jersey. He's played at the Apollo, Lincoln Center, Kennedy Center. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you taught yourself to play the organ around 9, is that right?
Yes, I taught myself when I was 9 to play Hammond.
To play the Hammond. Okay, so my only question for you is, given that, and now you've kind of got hooked up with Cameron as a mentor and a teacher, what's that like? Because I watched some of this earlier.
Okay. Well, it's different, first of all. It's different that, but I'm just so glad that he's taken me under his wing to help me learn more about, his organ and,
And your style.
in my style.
That's important.
Yeah, in how to, do different styles on,
So
different instruments.
I watched you guys earlier, and so Matthew was playing the international touring organ, and he said, I think I'd like this, I think I'd like that, because there are a lot of choices to be made. And I watched you guys coming back and forth, so I asked you, I said, did you mind that he changed back some of your things that you wanted?
I don't mind what he did. I don't mind. Right, as long as we both, as long as we both liked it, as long as we both like what the sound is, it's fine. It's
Well,
fine.
you see, there's the thing. I watched you guys kind of hash it out.
Yeah.
What you liked really mattered, and you turned to your mom and dad who were over there, and you said, Dad, is that good? Does that sound okay? Anyway, I was so happy you're here, and we're going to see you a little later. So we're gonna, another hand for Matthew Whitaker.
Thanks.
Yeah, wow, right? So, okay. So let's leave education and mentorship, and you've been like itching to keep talking about the organ, so now we're going to talk about the organ for about a certain amount of time, because I've realized that once we start, that could be, yeah. So this particular beast, as I called it today when I came in, this is just the most spectacularally complex organ that has ever been made. Am I right?
No, you're not at all. I'm
See,
sorry
there
to
you
say.
go. So let's start right there, because that might be a common misconception. So I'm going to throw some misconceptions
Thanks.
at you.
I love a good misconception. I get a lot of them. Well, first of all, what is this organ? Well, its proper name is the International Touring Organ. This organ is, like all instruments, has a provenance, and it comes from a maker. And it comes from a maker that is a renegade and in the long timeline of organ builders, which sometimes exist for centuries, quite a newcomer, but a radical one. The M&O stands for Marshall and Ogletree. This is their Opus 8, so it's their, so to say, 8th complete organ. It is the 3rd organ by Marshall and Ogletree that I've designed, following on one of their university organs and an organ at a church in Manhattan. And I'm happy to say that the maker of the organ, one half of Marshall and Ogletree, David Ogletree, is in the audience. So, David, happy to have him here. this synopsis of this instrument is that it is a paradox in a way. I hesitate to say it's a contradiction, but you find that a lot in organists, pointing the finger back at myself, in the sense that this organ is both a futurism in the Kurzweilian sort of way, and at the same time intensely traditional. It's obviously very radical in the sense of what it is and what it achieves.
So what's traditional?
Well, it's in other words, it's radical in its means, but traditional in its ends. The idea of so the organ is an instrument of some 2,600 years of history, depending on how you count and whom you ask. But the organ, as it exists in America, is where the zenith of organ building has been reached. The organ of Germany, of North Germany, the organ of the Low Countries, the organ of the time of Bach, a certain style, a certain history, a certain technological evolution. Taken further in France in the 19th century, the organ of 19th century France, as known by Liszt, Franck, and many others, would have to be the great evolution of that era of organ building. And England, of course, had their intensely different, but also cutting-edge ways. And there are other nationalities of organs which, for geopolitical reasons and technological ones as well, came together sometime, I think, starting in the late 19th century, but really coalescing beginning around 1910 in this country. And I like to think of the history of American organ building as quintessentially American in the sense that the country, at least, is supposed to be a melting pot of all kinds of cultures, which are represented more or less equally. That is what the so-called American municipal organ is. And if you were to submit, and as I do, submit this organ to the criticism of traditional and academic organists, what you find is that it's very easy to disabuse the idea that it's a cockpit or something. Not so. There are any number of organs, debatably even in this city, that have comparably complex interfaces. Certainly this is by no means the largest organ in the world or in the country in terms of musical resources, not by a long shot. Its family members, though, would be organs like the now long, in a way almost forgotten, but in storage, Pan-Pacific Exhibition organ that you used to have here in San Francisco, or the organ of the Palace of the Legion of Honor. There are similarities to aspects of those larger, big American organs, which were not designed to be church organs, but were multi-purpose instruments. And never, I think, was that concept of design reached so articulately or so cohesively ever in any other organ, because it couldn't be. The union of the idea of the theater organ, of the cinema organ, the unit principle of construction as popularized by builders like Wurlitzer and Kimball, but invented by Robert Hope Jones shortly before World War I, is based on mechanical ideals which are essentially tonally, physically separate and unlike the way that the traditional concert and church organs are assembled. So there is an inherent infrastructural reason that those twains are hardly ever meeting. And many of the large, big organs of, say, before 1935 in this country, many of which are now silent, but a few of which are well-known and restored, such as the Kochmar organ in Merrill Auditorium in Maine, or there are several others, follow this principle. And they're musical instruments that are designed to do a wide variety of things.
Yeah, I hear range as the primary thing, but I also heard the word secular, and that leads to a lot of the talk that you and I have had about, being, I don't want to say being unorthodox, but certainly shying away from orthodoxies.
That's
and
right.
Saying that there's no limitations on what you can see this organ doing.
Well,
and that was the point.
The limitations are, and I think that Matthew has, and as he will later in the concert, really demonstrated this. The limitations are, of course, in me, not in the instrument. I'm, for instance, not a jazz musician. I can do a little. I play the theater organ after a fashion, but the theater organ is not jazz. It's sort of its own thing, and rather po-faced, actually, compared to jazz in some ways. But the organ as I play it, in some ways, I push it very, very hard. But my musical interests are actually pretty conservative. You're going to hear Wagner tonight. You're going to hear Bach. You'll hear maybe a piece of mine, and some things like that. but it's perfectly possible for Matthew to play this organ in a fashion which has nothing to do with the theater organ or the way I play it, but which is legitimate jazz. And I always wondered if that would be possible. It, in fact, is. I mean, we can hear recordings of Fats Waller playing the Wurlitzer, and it doesn't sound like, for instance, George Wright, who was one of the great cinema organists who later was a television organist of distinction. So, again, the magic thing about the organ is that it is, one of the magical things about it is that it is ultimately, a great organ is a malleable, flexible medium. And as organists, we forget that at our peril. And I think the demonstration of that is rife in the organ scene of today. When I'm quite unabashed about saying that when you have the specter, and I do consider it a specter, of well-known, established, conservative academic organists performing at the opening of a major concert hall organ and deflecting the applause to the organ, this is not for me just a gestural mistake. It's a deep-seated symptom of the abdication of personality from the organ scene, which has been a gradual, creeping, insidious, destructive force in the last 60 years. And it really has to be called out as such and addressed.
So is that taught? Is that a taught attitude, or is that's traditionalism?
I think that it can be taught by dint of demonstration. I would prove, well, as if I had to prove it, I guess I would try to demonstrate that it's, I think, very easy to see how it's being taught sort of, in inversion. When you go into the conservatories of America, about which I think I have earned my $40,000 of student debt to comment,
That's pretty good.
about Juilliard or whatever the other conservatories are, which, as we all know, generally take their cues from Juilliard, you'll find a place in which, let's put it this way, however much personality may flourish, there seems to be a consistent attempt to discourage it from doing so, from so doing. And certain conservatories are worse offenders than others. Juilliard is probably one of the better places at the moment to look for personality. But yes, I think it is taught in the sense that I think it can be taught in the sense that it is taught out of people.
Well, I think that, part of that comes down to, and this extends to my chosen field as well, to ballet and dance in general, the notion of higher calling. But I can't imagine an instrument more overlapping with those two words than the organ, because of its association with church and religion.
That's right.
That there is a higher calling to doing this, and therefore personality is to be subsumed by that higher calling.
Well, I think the Mormon approach to the organ, and the Mormons have built in their new temple in Salt Lake, probably the most important and most ambitious of the great American municipal organs in history. The new 5-manual Schoenstein. It's an absolutely staggering instrument. They don't pay their organists as a matter of belief. And you may say that, if I were confronted about this by a Mormon who might say to me, you may not think much of Joseph Smith, to which I'd of course say, you're absolutely right about that. I would have to say, what is exactly being said about the value of the person and of their activity? I would be clear that I think the organ has, if it can maintain it, I suppose it has a place in church. I wouldn't know. It's my position that I'm happy to have the giggles, but I'm telling you, I'm totally serious. I've done more jobbing on church organs. I mean, I'm actually not a newcomer to the scene of musical performance. I've played from, let's say, 1999 to about 2005 or 6. I played extensively in what you'd call the organ circuit in America, which is peopled by, an incredibly dedicated brotherhood of, and it mostly is a brotherhood, but let's say a guild of incredibly talented, hardworking people who seem, I think, to settle for too little. And it's my position that given the fact that classical music is generally acknowledged, serious music, to be in possibly an irremediable crisis, nobody jumps up when I say in interviews or in talks, well, now that we're in the fin de siècle of classical music, everybody says, oh, yes, that's true. Nobody's wildly objecting. I think the pressure is ever more strongly on to rally around the organ, and the organist, but in a different way. And it's impossible to do if the organ only remains a sacred instrument. It's very important to remember, by the way, and I don't see how I can burst any bubbles by saying this, but it needs to be said, that whenever we're told that the organ is a Christian instrument or an instrument of God, it should immediately put us on our guard. Because then you know, of course, that you're talking to a person who's ignorant of history. The organ, of course, comes to us not from Christianity, but from ancient Greece, in the form of the hydraulis, which is much closer to a modern organ than you'd think. I mean, organs in the 19th century in England were also driven by water.
Do we have Greek organ music?
We have
Ancient, so to speak?
Not really, because we don't have Petrucci, who gave us what amounted to the modern engraving of music. What we do have are texts and artifacts which establish the presence of the organ in a secular and in a strategic light. In other words, it's obviously much more likely.
I'm going to totally go out on a limb with you here and ask you, what do you think it sounded like?
Oh, I think it's actually very possible to know that.
Could you show us what you think it sounded like?
It's just a very, very. It'll be kind of anticlimactic. I think there would be two things.
There's plenty to come.
Well, I think there would be two things. I think it would somehow sound sort of like this if you were really in the hydraulis as we think of it in the engravings. It probably sounds something like this. The reason being that it would have had a drone, and it would have had other pipes which were physically, manually lifted in and out of holes, and it would have been incredibly loud. Or it would have been a little thing which probably would have sounded, again, can't know how it would have been tuned or what pitches it would have had, but it might have, a tabletop sort of affair might have sounded a little bit like this. I don't really think it would have had a keyboard as we know it. Now, there are historians who can do this better, but the point I'm making here is not so much about the literality of what that instrument was that as much as the fact that when you have a pressurized columns of air, pipes, speech, labial, manner of generating sound, in some cases a very loud sound, and you have the ultimate thing that defines an organ, the ability to sustain tone independent of human stamina. That is the organ in a nutshell, because this is what gives the organ its self-similarity. It is the reason that is terribly important is that we mustn't. The organ has its role in Christian church. I don't want to take that away from anyone. Like all aspects of Christianity, people are more than happy to play with those toys. They mustn't make me play with them, or my children play with them, but they're welcome to them. But let's never forget that if the organ is the instrument of God, it would have to be plural gods. Because, of course, Greece was polytheistic. Yes. And I just want to put that out there.
How is your advocacy for the modern organ and the modern organist met by this guild of organists that you have?
Well, the thing about
you're a part of.
Yeah, did you say that I've become a part of?
That you're a part of. I mean,
but I'm not a part of.
Well, but you are just simply by being an organist. There's,
I'm a member of the Brotherhood of Organists by general
profession.
Inclusion. Yes,
but
yes.
You mentioned unionism earlier, and I started picturing you as Norma Ray at a certain point, and I thought,
I was going for Rosie the Riveter, but okay.
That's okay. It's like,
well,
just go through the decades, keep going. Yeah.
The thing is, you might better ask the audience. I can imagine, perhaps by a show of hands, or if you like, booing. Have we any organists in the audience? Boo! There you go. Well, that's totally legitimate. You have a few more. So let's call it, let's say something like 15% or 20%. So that's difficult to quantify because the community is a small one, and I happen to know that I have a number of organists who absolutely love what I do and are very vocal about that. And I'm sure there are the other kind. And as long as they pay for their tickets, I'm very happy for them to come. And they tend to.
The great equalizer.
They
Yes.
do tend to, and they're absolutely welcome. And those skeptics and people who are negative, unless they actually are, really physically unpleasant or unstable people, I suppose are absolutely also welcome to play the organ. I have news for you. I mean, if I can do it and not break it, you're not going to either. So, I mean, again, the organ is for all. But I would say this: I think that if the organ is to survive in a non-religious context, the game needs to be upped, and it can't really be done by installing more and more large, expensive pipe organs in concert halls. We're now reaching the end of a sort of 30 to 35-year arc of administrative decisions and donor behavior, which will, in future years, be viewed as the equal of anything that occurred in the most ravaging excesses of the 1920s, which is the idea that, starting with the installation of the Fisk organ at the Meyerson Center in the mid-90s, the idea that the only path of respectability for an American concert hall was the installation of a usually European pipe organ. Now, I've played many of those instruments, and they're all, most of them are actually fantastic as musical instruments, but remember that that one can almost go into the program booklets of those dedications over the years, pull out the text, and swap it around to the next one. It's the same thing. It's the same expectation. It's the same language, whether you're talking about the launch of the Kimmel Center or the opening of Benaroya, both essentially forgotten big organs that are, sort of locally attended by the same 200 people, that, you have to see the same language talking about, well, now that we've got the great organ at this hall, which cost some millions of dollars, the organ, not the hall, surely now this will make a great organ scene in Pittsburgh or in Des Moines or what have you. And within 3 years, there's a sort of Sunday morning at 11 a.m. organ recital series, and once in a while a silent movie, and every 6 years the SFJAZZ. I'm not told that is an acceptable situation for the future of the young organist, and I'm certainly not to be told that simply by dint of the installation of these instruments, any one of which could endow not only numerous scholarships, but internet-connected matching Marshall and Ogletree organs, here and there and everywhere, that we're actually doing much to encourage a future in which an organist can compete with a pianist. That's I think, not shown.
That's an interesting point right there. I mean, you just said the idea of competing with other instrumentalists, if you will, that, how important is that to you as a musician?
Well, I'm a very minor figure in the grand scheme of music. I mean, they sometimes let me on a red carpet and at an obscure European record awards and stuff.
We're going to talk about you in a second.
I know Yuja Wang pretty well. I get to hang out with some glamorous people once in a while, but I'm in the totem pole of even the very microcosmic world of classical music. I'm extremely outspoken, but still, unfortunately, rather small fish. This doesn't bother me really, because I believe very much in what I'm doing, and I also come from a non-musical family in a part of the country where my father, who, by the way, has led a completely satisfying and incredible life as an inventor and an engineer, literally could not tell you the difference between the music of Bruckner and Bernstein and has not been poorer for it. So I'm sort of the last person to judge my own, career by classical standards.
But, okay, so let's extend it, and we're going to come back to you in a second, but just extend that question then just to organists in general. Like the ability of an organist to play in the field in the same way that a pianist does.
Yes.
Is part of the larger mission, obviously.
Well, yeah, and that's got to be a long view, because there's
a lot about what this instrument's about.
It is and it isn't. I mean, this instrument is my personal property. And it is a machine that I have caused to be built primarily for myself. And I don't want to make any bones about that. But it also doesn't always have to be that. That doesn't have to always be true. And I also, by the way, have been vocal about the fact that I don't intend to spend the rest of my life performing. So, I mean, this organ's going to have a future, I hope, that's going to be way beyond me. And it's already having a rather incredible sort of cellular existence, in the sense that it has now spawned, I don't like the word, it has generated a one-to-one sister organ which matches it exactly, which will now be the first permanent digital organ in an American concert hall at the Kravis Center for the Performing Arts in West Palm Beach, where Matthew and I, with the Jacksonville Symphony, will open the organ on March 9th, 2016, which happens to be the exact 2-year anniversary of the launch of this organ at Lincoln Center. So you see,
Getting vaguely
this is
astrological.
getting somehow a little bit Neil deGrasse Tyson. And I think that's important, because now you're talking about two organs that can talk to each other online, and two places. Let's say this organ became at some point, the Aspen Artist Initiative Institute organ or something, and we sent it around to the great universities and so on, and young organists started to have relationships with it. Well, anybody who had spent, say, a week with this organ preparing a recital, doesn't matter what kind, theater, classical, whatever they want, could then take their USB drive, go down to the Kravis Center, and instantly be ready to play. Now, you might not know, if you don't play the organ, that is something to be regarded with wonder and even a little trepidation, in the sense that playing an organ that you don't know has always been about accommodating the instrument and adjusting to these instruments which have nothing to do with each other, are utterly site-specific. That is one of the fabulous things about the pipe organ. It's one of the great joys, and we won't lose it. However, we will lose a chance for organists to have a foothold in serious music making if we can't give them the ability to take their brand, because classical music is not only entertainment, it is and must be a business, and can reach some of its highest heights when it's regarded as such, if done responsibly. Shouldn't be a surprise, by the way, with the organ, as it is the most expensive and logistically demanding instrument. One has to have something of the entrepreneurial spirit to play it well. We can build a future in which it's not as though I see an organ on every corner. It's just that I want to be sure that playing continues to increase exponentially in more and more creative directions, and doesn't just masquerade under its current heading of tolerance for restoration, interest in different styles, and an annual sort of Halloween, showing of the organ. That's not what I want for the future of the instrument. I think we can do better. And of course, technology is going to help us get there.
Okay. So we have probably about 5 minutes left, and I know they want to open the house. The house is open, everybody can come in, but we're going to have to give you a tiny break
Understandably,
before you
that's
begin.
fine.
I want to first of all rebut your statement about you not being
Bring it on.
extremely high on the totem pole of musicians in the world. I think that's
A
just
couple of
absolute nonsense.
got some
I've
integers.
watched you just sell out the largest halls that in America just by yourself, and it's the power of what you're doing actually is speaking for itself. But we'll leave it at that.
Some nights better than others, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
I do want to talk about you for one last thing, though, just about you as a person. So I always think about heroes. Who are people's heroes? So I wanted to ask you who your heroes were, or if there's one person
David
who was a
Bowie.
hero. David Bowie.
Yeah, of course.
Right, okay. I spent a little time yesterday with John Adams, who sends his regards, by the way.
Love John.
And
Great composer.
we were talking about heroes, and he said, well, I think Cameron once said that his hero was actually Karl Lagerfeld.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think we've talked about that, too. And I have to say, are you having fun?
Oh, you don't think?
I think you are. Yeah. Because,
It's great
I
fun.
think that's really important.
Well, I think it is, and actually, I think there's a good argument to be made for the idea that good organ playing is good fun. I've spent an inordinate amount of time and obsession getting everything right on this machine, because when I sit here, I'm at home. And do you know why these tabs are actually blue? I mean, you couldn't know.
No, please.
Well, I mean,
I hear
the
you
organ
cry.
the organ has different colors because it's like a sort of an organization of different sections of the organ. By the way, the organ is the ultimate self-similar machine. Each of these is also an organ. Each keyboard is an organ of its own, and each subsection of the keyboard, each individual stop, corresponds to all the values of how we define an organ, and in fact, there are even organs that have one stop that's still an organ. So this whole concept of self-similarity and self-referentiality is something that other instruments don't have. The reason that the stops are organized by color is to tell you what family of the organ, what geographic location they live in, and places in the organ where a great panoply of color it shows up demonstrates to you that that's a part of the organ. That's a real melting pot.
Why are those blue?
But the real reason these stops are blue is because when I was a little boy and just becoming interested in the organ, my parents used to take me to Dick Bowling's World of Music in Erie, Pennsylvania, where they had this sort of organs with a keyboard here and a keyboard there that you might get into church basement or grandma's house. And I remember there was one that had the most luscious, beautiful dark blue stops. And I just used to think about those at night when I would go to sleep and dream that one day I could own such a great organ as a Baldwin Spinet. And so now I've got blue stops, damn it. Oh my God. So,
all right, well, listen, we could talk for a long time, but I want to just say that, you know, it's just such a wonderful experience, not only to hear you play, but to hear you talk.
thank you. Tell that to the guys online.
Yeah, okay, we will. And I think, you know, you deserve a big congratulations on launching the education initiative today. So I want to say congratulations on that.
I'll head up the applause by simply deflecting it back at you, at the Aspen Institute, for giving me the chance to do what I do, and to come out to Aspen last summer was a transformational thing, as it would have to be. And I'm extremely indebted to SFJAZZ, to Tony for managing as he does, and to Jeff. And to everybody for allowing me to bring in somebody I felt needed to be here. But I'm extremely grateful to all of you for showing your interest, possibly your disagreement, hopefully not your aggression. But your participation, it's very, very much appreciated, and I hope you enjoy the music.
Absolutely. Cameron Carpenter.